This is the shir of Gimel, Tishrei, Tav Kuf Lamed Amud Aleph. Now, again, the Nekud of the Sigeres HaKedesh is the idea of Yesh Mayayim. Yesh Mayayim means the creation of Nivrayim, that although they were made by the Eibishter, were made by the Eibishter in such a way that there should be Yesh. Yesh means separate in their hergish, in their feeling. Obviously, as far as Hashem is concerned, everything is one with Hashem because of Achdos and Tzimtzum Shalai Kipshutei. But from the perspective of the Nevrayim, Yesh means a Nivra that feels itself separate from the Eibishter. And the Alter Rebbe says that Yesh Me'ayin is a very special inyan to create things that are separate. He says, B'Lashon HaKedesh, it's called Bria. And the opposite of Yesh Me'ayin is called Ila V'Yolo. Ila means you create a creation that still, after it was separate from its source, bottled to the source. And as I explained to you, in the whole Seder Shtashos, everything is Ila V'Yolo. From Bria to Yitzira, of Mitzira to Asiyah Ruchnis, and then in Atzilas and in Sof, in Madregas of Ruchnis, it's all Ila V'Yolo. The lower Madrege came from the higher Madrege, and when it was in the higher Madrege, it was bottled. And when it comes out of the higher Madrege, it's still bottled. The exception is Yesh Me'ayin. And in the last year, the Alter Rebbe gave dugmois for the finest Madregas of Yesh Me'ayin. What are the finest Madregas Yesh Me'ayin? The Kelim of Naran of Bia, and the Oires of Nefesh Ruach of Bia. In other words, in Elam HaBriya Yitzir Nasiyah, there's Kelim of Elam HaBriya Yitzir Nasiyah, and the Kelim of Briya Yitzir Nasiyah, B'Klos are divided up into three, Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. And each one of the different types of Kelim are Nivra, they're not Alakus, they're Yesh. Into these Kelim goes Oir, but not all of these different types of Oir are Yesh. Only Oir Nefesh Ruach. You'll see later on, Oir Neshama is very special. Oir Neshama is Alakus, and it's Gvul. And it's still, and as much as his Havas is concerned, Oir Neshama is a very unusual concept, because it comes into Briya because it's limited, and at the same time it's still Alakus. You'll see later on that this is what conducts, what carries the Keich of Yesh Me'ayin. So the Alter Rebbe said in the last Shir that the first Yeshes are the Kelim of Naran of Bia and the Oires of Nefesh Ruach of Bia, not Nesham. And he added another thing also, the Gufes of the Malachim. Even the Malachim in Atzilus, the Gufes of the Malachim in Atzilus are also Nivra. Okay, and now we continue with today's Shir that we're holding Gimel. However, Neshames HaMalachim, the Neshames of Malachim, as opposed to the Guf of Malachim, Shiyatzum Zivik Neshikin, they come from a Zivik called Neshikin, a kiss. V'chenishmas Adam, as well as the Neshama of a person. Shiyatzum Zivik, the Zun Da'atzilus, which comes from a Yivik, a Zun Da'atzilus. And by Neshama, he doesn't divide the Neshama up into the Guf and the Neshama. He says the Malach has a Guf and a Neshama. The Guf of a Malach is Nivra, the Neshama of a Malach is Elakus. And by the Neshama, he says that the Neshama of Sa'adim, before they come into B'yat Nasi, is like the Alter Rebbe, Einon B'chlal Yesh V'davar Nifra L'fnei. They're not separate from the Eibishter. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe is saying what? That in Atzilus, the Gufes of the Malachim are Yesh, the Neshama of the Malachim and the Neshamas of Yidden are not Yesh. They're Olakus. They're not Yesh yet. Continues Alter Rebbe and he says, however, and by the way, there's a very big difference in Zivik Neshikin and Zivik Gufni. Malachim come from a Zivik Neshikin. It's called a kiss. A kiss is a Ruchnis de Kashpa. You give a person a kiss, it's a Ruchnis de Kashpa. From a Ruchnis de Kashpa, you can't create Yesh Me'ayin. Nothing new comes into being. The Maila of a kiss is that the result of the kiss is Lefiyerech. In other words, a Zivik of Neshikin creates a Nivra which is much closer to the kiss, but has no etzem. It's not Yesh Me'ayin. Malachim come from a Zivik Zun. A Zivik Zun is called a Zivik Gufni. You know, we're learning in the Samavav in the morning that there's Neshamas of Avah and Neshamas of Zun. Neshamas of Avah have a very big problem because Malachim come from Avah. Neshamas come from Zun. Because Neshamas were designed by Hashem to be a real Metzias. And to be a real Metzias, they have to have a real etzem. And to have a real etzem, have to be a Zivik Gufni. A Zivik Neshikin, a Zivik Ruchni is not enough. And the Zivik Gufni is Dafka Zun and not Avah. But putting that detail aside, the Neshamas of Malachim, as opposed to the Guf of Malachim, and the Neshamas Yisrael, In Atzilus, they're a lakus. But there's a catch. What's the catch? Ella, but rather, they still are similar to the godliness of the Esses Sfiras. However, they're similar to the godliness. Esses Sfiras betimtzumat with an enormous contraction. And they're best compared to the Kalim as opposed to the Oyer of the 10 Sfiras of Atzilus. Sheim bebchinas gvul, which are limited. They did Tzimtzum Ein Sof through limiting the Ein Sof. Who are Kav HaMalubish, through the Kav which is manifest in Naran Shalem and their Naran. Ukumay Tzimtzum Adishan Liyas Cholol V'chuli, like the first Tzimtzum, which creates an emptiness and a space, creates Medida V'Hagbala. Similarly, the Nishamis and the Gufas of the Malachim are Nivra, similar to the Gvul of the Kalim of Atzilus. Now, I want to say this quickly, because if I say this slowly, we'll be until tomorrow morning. Kalim are Gvul. That's the they're Gvul. This is a shtickle, apparently I'm a chodges in Kabbalah, but this is the Arizal Shita. Kalim are Gvul. But Kalim are Lakus. The Moshe for Kalim are like fiery coals, like sparks, nitutzes. Pieces of fire. They're Lakus. And Kalim have another aspect. And the other aspect of Kalim is that they're attached to Oyer. And by being attached to the Oyer, which is mislabish in them, they're attached also to the Oyer, which is higher than mislabish in them. A Malach's Neshama and the Neshama of a Yid is also a Keli. It's a vessel. But it's not attached. It's Yotsu v'Nifadu. They're separate. So when Atzilus Gufa, the Kalim of Atzilus, although the Kalim of Atzilus are Gavul, but because they're attached to Oyer, and Oyer is attached to a higher Oyer, and so forth and so on, so there it's still connected to the Ein Sof Mamish. Neshamis and the Neshamis of Malachim and Atzilus are also Lakus, they're also fire, they're also Batal Hashem B'Yetzim, but they're things that are Batal Hashem B'Yetzim, and they don't have that Dveikus of Oyer that Kalim have. And therefore, a Neshama and the Neshama of a Malach is much, much smaller than a Keli, although it's similar to the Keli, in the respect that it has a Metzias and that it has a Medida of Agbala and so forth. Now the Alter Rebbe continues. He says, now that I explained to you that in Atzilus, there are things other than Eiris and Kalim which are Lakus, namely the Neshamas of Malachim and the Neshamas Yisrael, but they're Yotzav v'Nifad, they're separate from the Iyov HaChayech and the Iyov HaMeichad. Says the Alter Rebbe, V'avgam la'achash yadu and around Atzilus l'olam hazeh. Moreover, there are certain Neshamas that the way they were created in Atzilus, they're a Lakus, although they're Yotzav v'Nifradu, that the nature of their Lakus is such that even when this neshama comes down into this world, it continues to be godliness. La tzadikim arasherim, to earlier tzadikim. Says the Alter Rebbe, Efsher, it's possible. Shalei nishtanem u'husam, their essence did not change. Liyez davanifet melakus, to be separate from the Eibishter. In other words, even though these neshamas came into this world, they're still a lakus. Me'ein keil nesasvidas atzilas. And as a result, hayu mistalkas, they would pass away. Kisharatzo lachte, when they wanted to sin. Before they sin, which is a weird concept. If you're neshama datzilas, why would you want to sin? And if you want to sin, then you're not neshama datzilas. But there's a certain chalishas they had apparently, and as a result of this chalishas, and the Eibishter didn't want them to be nichshal, so the Eibishter took them away. In other words, let me say it in these words: the idea of a neshama is summarized in a simple phrase. The phrase is Elakus Shenasa Nivra. A neshama means godliness as it's become a thing. That's what a neshama is. Neshama is called Elakus Shenasa Nivra. Godliness has become a thing. Normally, you have two choices. Either you're godly or you're not godly. In other words, Atzilus is Ein Sof. Bria is Nivra. A neshama is two things. It's a Nivra, it's separate from Elakus, but at the same time, it's Elakus Shenasa Nivra. It's godliness in its separated state. That's what's unique about a neshama. Neshamas of Atzilus are Lakus Shenasa Nivra, that the Lakus is Beizgalos. And because the Lakus is Beizgalos, even the way they come Lamata, they have Neshachas to Inyanim of Chet. Lower Neshamas, although they're also a Lakus Shenasa Nivra, but as they come down into the lower worlds, they cease to be godly. Begilun. And Alter Rebbe continues and he says, V'kar of Leimat, you can also say, Shagam Allah from the River Beis Almin, the thousands and myriads of worlds, the Yasva begogalto the Arach v'Zah that sit in the skull of Arach and Zah. In other words, the Keser of Keser and the Keser of Zeir Ampin. Says the Alter Rebbe, Einon Alman Mamish. They're not worlds Mamish. Keinai Cholav da Atzilus u'bechinas Yesh, like the chambers of Atzilus, which are an Indian of Yesh. Ella, but rather ke'en neshamas hamalachim, like the souls of angels. Sheyatzu mezivig hanashikin, which come from a zivig of a kiss. V'nikru alman, they're simply called worlds. Legabe, when to compare to bechinas hagalta v'dikna, compared to the skull and to the beard. Now this is hoyle kabbalah. This is reine kabbalah. The nekuda what Alter Rebbe just said is as follows. In general, when you talk about Atzilus, there's two categories. The higher category of Atzilus is Iva Chayei Echad, Iva Gemei Echad. What's connected to Ein Sof? That's as a Sfidus. That's the Beis Hamikdash Etzelakus. The lower category is everything else. In Atzilus itself, there are other things besides the Esses Sfidus, whose inyan is Iva Chayei Echad, Iva Gemei Echad. But the way Atzilus develops is as follows. The Esses form, all the 10 Sfidus form, from Malchus of Atzilus, the world of Atzilus is created. It's like a baby, yeah? A fetus. The brain forms first, and from the brain, the rest of the body forms. Similarly, the 10 Sfidus form, and from the Malchus of the 10 Sfidus, the whole world of Atzilus is developed. The world of Atzilus, which develops around the Sfidus of Atzilus, like a body around the brain, is called Hecholos. And in the Echos, you have Neshamas and Malach. So first of all, the Rebbe says, the Neshamas and Malachim, the Neshama of the Malach, and Neshamas Yisrael, are a lakus, even though they're created from Malchus. And then he says something Eideler. There's a concept of worlds higher than Malchus. In Zoh and in Kesed, there's also even worlds. In other words, even though typically the world of Atzilus is created from Malchus of Atzilus, there are aspects written in Kabbalah that are created in Atzilus, not from Malchus of Atzilus, but rather from the Eirampin or from Arachampin of Atzilus. Says the Alter Rebbe, whatever it is that those worlds are, in quotations, I don't know what it means, but whatever those worlds are, that are in Zoh and in Kesed, in Galgalta of Atzilus, they're not Yesh v'Nivid like Yecholos, they're Yesh v'Nivid like Malachim's, Neshamas of Malachim and Neshamas Yisrael. In short, with 3 inyanim in Atzilus. The Esses Sfidus, which are Iva Chayei Echad, Iva Gemei Echad, that's one extreme godliness. Then the aspects of Atzilus which are Mamish Nivra, like the Hecholos. In between those two, there's a middle category, things which are separate from the Esses Sfidus and the Elakus. And they are the Neshamas of Malachim, Neshamas Yisrael, and the Almin, the Yasmin, Begalgalta, the Zoh, or Begalta, the Arich. And other stuff. That's the Bekitza Nimrit. Says the Alter Rebbe, however, having said that in Atzilus there are things other than the Esses Sfidus that are Elakus, namely the Neshamas of Malachim and Neshamas Yisrael. But Ein and Elakus Mamish, they're not sufficiently godly, or they're not godly in the same way, Livre Yesh Me'ayin, to create Yesh Me'ayin. Me'acha because Shekva Yotzu V'nifredu Me'akelim the Yotzfidus. Because they've gone out and separate from 10 kelim of Atzilus. That's what Atzilus. Here goes to the point. The Igeres HaKedesh started off to say that it says in Tikkun Ezer, Iva Chayei Echad, Iva Gemei Echad, Hashem's light and His vessels are one. And the Alter Rebbe asks, what does this mean? And the Alter Rebbe answers, this means to create Yesh Me'ayin. In order to create Yesh Me'ayin, the kelim have to be one with the light. You'll see later on why. Says the Alter Rebbe, this idea that the kelim are one with the light, and therefore the kelim, create Yesh Me'ayin is not true of the kelim. It's not true of a neshama. It's not true of the neshama of a malach. Although neshamas and neshamas of malachim are they're taka lakus, but they're not Iva Chayei V'Gemei Echad. And because they're not Iva Chayei V'Gemei Echad, they're not connected to the kav. And I'll read it again. Shekva Yotzu V'Nifredu, even the shamas, which are lakus, but they're in Atzilus, but they're lakus and eifn of Yotzu V'Nifredu Me'akelim the Yud Sfidus. They're separate from the 10 Sfidus. Shebehem Meluba Shel HaKav, in which is revealed the HaKav. Me'ed Ein Sof, an infinite light of the Rebishter. Okay? And only kelim which are connected to the Erakav, to the Ein Sof, has a kerech for Yesh Me'ayin. Okay, let me give you a short hagdam. This Igeres HaKedesh has a kasha, as I told you in the very, very beginning. The kasha in this Igeres HaKedesh is, how does Yesh Me'ayin happen? How is the Yeshus down here? If all the Ruchnizdika worlds are Ilaviyol, are Ayin, if all the Ruchnizdika words are Ilaviyol, all the Ruchnizdika words are Ayin, how does Yeshus happen? This is the fundamental question. And the answer is Ein Sof. The question is, how could Ein Sof create Yesh Me'ayin? Ein Sof is the ultimate Ayin. Ein Sof is called Ayin. And the Alter Rebbe is going to be Mechadash HaChidush, that although Ein Sof is bottled to the Eibishter, You meet Eid Ein Sof, Ein Sof has no yeshus whatsoever. The whole reality of Eid Ein Sof is it's bittul to the Eibishter. But Eid Ein Sof has another aspect. And that is these words, look at them inside. Sha'ayir, that Eid Ein Sof, in addition to being infinite and a perfect reflection of the Eibishter, has another inyan, and that is Rukein HaMoed. Light is a perfect reflection of the source. What is the source? Hu muhusei v'atzmusei, turn the page, Shalamaytil Baruch of the Eibishter himself. And because the Oyer is Me'ein HaMoed, the Oyer is a perfect reflection of the Eibishter. And everything that the Eibishter has is revealed in the Oyer, you have a very big chiddush, and that is Shemitz Yusei, when it comes to Hashem, we know that the Eibishter's Metzias, whom Yatzmusei, comes from himself. In other words, Ve'eni alul me'ez ilah shekad melechas v'shalom. Nobody comes before the Eibishter. Nobody made God. The very tight Eibishter is yesh, has no source. Oid Ein Sof, we know Oid Ein Sof to be ayin. But in addition to Ein Sof being ayin, there's a concept of Ein HaMoed. Ein HaMoed means light has to have every quality of the source, even the qualities of the source that the light doesn't have. What does the light not have that the Eibishter has? Yeshus. The Eibishter has no dependency. The light has a complete dependency upon the Eibishter. But because of the principle of Ein HaMoed, Oyer even has the quality of Yeshus that Oyer shouldn't have. Mitzad the dveikus of Ein HaMoed, mitzad the fact that Ein HaMoed, Oyer has every mile the Moed has except Yeshus. But because of the idea that it's Me'ein HaMoed, that everything the Moed has, the Oyer has, Oyer is carrying a Yeshus, although the Oyer is not a Yesh at all. And therefore, hu levade, only the Eibishter alone, and as a result, the oil, because it's Mein HaMoed, is has the power and the possibility to create something in a way that is removed from its source completely, to the extent that it seems as if it has no source whatsoever. Or any cause, direct or indirect, that precedes this independent being. So the Alter Rebbe is saying a very, very big chiddush. How could Yeshus exist? How could a world exist that's separate from the Eibishter? And the answer is that the Yeshus comes from the Yeshus of Atzmas Ein Sof. The Yeshus, the independence of this world, comes from the independence of the Eibishter. But how could the independence of the Eibishter come to us if we're created through Seder Shtalshalos? And in Seder Shtalshalos, everything is bottle. And the answer is, Oid has a qual called Me'ein HaMoed, so it carries Yeshus, although the Eid itself is not a Yesh at all. And when does this Yeshus manifest? It manifests at the end of Seder Shtalshalos. Okay, stop. Ukadei, and in order, that the Yesh should actually happen, Bekoyach Ein Sof, from the power of Ein Sof. And we want this Yesh should be Bal Gvul Umida, limited and measured. Says the Alter Rebbe, Nislabish Ein Sof Bekelim the Yitzvidas Datzilus. The infinite light of Hashem comes down to the vessels of the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Umisyached betoichenem, comes one with them. Betachas hayichud, with the greatest measure of oneness. Ad iyuv hagamei echad, that the light becomes one with the vessels. Livre behen val yadon, to create with them and through them beruim, creations that have alagvul v'tachas, that are limited with a specific purpose. And of course, this means also the idea of Yeshus. Ubefrat idea slapshus and bebiyah, and especially by it coming down into biyah, as you'll see Mitzvah Hashem on daf. I suppose you'd say on daf kuf lamed alef amud beis. The catch is like this: Yeshus has to come from the Eibishter, from Atzmos. The only way, according to what's written in this against the Kiddush, Yeshus comes from Atzmos is through Oyer. Even though Oyer itself, in other words, the personality of Oyer is Ayin, but Oyer carries a Yeshus, which is not manifest in Oyer. You don't see it. If you meet Oyer himself, you'll see Bitl, you're not going to see Yeshus. But even though you'll meet Oyer, you'll only see Bitl, you won't see Yeshus. Since Oyer Me'ein HaMoed has every quality of the Eibishter, it's carrying in a hidden way Yeshus. When does it manifest? When it goes into Kalim. But this is the Tach Iyav HaGamoy Echad. Where does the Koyach Ein Sof manifest? Only in those Kalim that are attached to Ein Sof. A Neshama may be Alakus and Gvul. The Neshama of a Malach may be Alakus and Gvul. But they're not Iyav HaGamoy Echad. The Neshama is not one with Ein Sof. And because the Neshama is not one with Ein Sof, the Neshama can't create Yesh Me'ayin. Only the Kalim can. Because the Kalim are one with Ein Sof, and through their ones with Ein Sof, they're able to create Yesh Me'ayin. So to summarize, this is a little bit long-winded, but the summary of what we learned today is In Atzilus, but close to 3 categories. There are things in Atzilus which are already yesh, like the Echolos. There's the 10 spheres of Atzilus, where the Kelim, the moment 8 in Sof, and therefore they're able to create yesh meyayin. And in between those 2, you have a neshama and the neshama of a malach and other things, which are lakus. But because Yotzav and Nifredu did not one with 8 in Sof, they have no koyach to create yesh meyayin. Okay, this was the shir of Tem Gedalia.